My life pretty much fell apart the day my wife, Jessica, walked out on me. She had it all planned, leaving me for her affair partner, Sean, and expecting to ride off into the sunset with a share of my family's trust fund. But what she didn't count on was the shock she'd face when she got back from their romantic getaway in Italy. No money, no future, and a legal storm waiting for her. Let me back up a bit. I'm Eric, a 30-year-old guy who grew up with people who liked me because of one thing: my family's wealth. To be clear, my parents built their success from scratch, and they worked hard to secure the future. Sure, I come from money, but I've always been serious about proving that I can contribute to the business. I grind every day to make sure I don't mess up what my dad created, and I'm not the type to live the stereotypical trust fund lifestyle. Still, that didn't stop people from trying to get close to me for all the wrong reasons. In college, I never bothered with dating. I was the kind of guy who only wanted to be in a relationship if it led to something serious like marriage. But as soon as people found out about my parents' success, it got harder to find someone genuine. A lot of people just saw me as the rich guy who would throw extravagant parties and pay for their fun. Spoiler, I wasn't that guy. Sure, I helped out some friends and paid for a few drinks here and there, but nothing excessive. I didn't want to live up to the trust fund baby stereotype. That all changed when I met Jessica. It was at a graduation party, and she didn't seem to know who I was. We hit it off instantly. I was hooked because, for the first time, I felt like someone saw me for who I really was, not for what I had. Our first date was at McDonald's, nothing fancy, but we had a blast. That's when I started to believe I'd finally found someone who liked me for me. Jessica was smart, laid back, and didn't care about my wealth, or at least that's what I thought at the time. After a month of dating, I took her to meet my parents, and she wasn't fazed by the wealth or the huge house. She acted like it was no big deal. I took it as a sign that she didn't care about money, which, in hindsight, was a massive mistake. It didn't even cross my mind that she probably knew all along who I was and had a plan to get what she wanted from me. She was the first woman I ever introduced to my parents, and they adored her. We dated for a year, and during that time, Jessica never accepted any expensive gifts from me. She'd always say, "We're not married yet. It's too soon for that." I found it charming, like she was being humble. A year later, I proposed, and she said yes. From the start, Jessica won over my parents with her charm and even promised them she wouldn't quit her job, saying she wanted to contribute to building our future together. My parents were thrilled. On our second wedding anniversary, they threw a huge party and surprised Jessica with the announcement that they'd added her as a beneficiary to the family trust fund. They even introduced her to Bob, the trustee who managed the legal aspects of the fund. At that time, everything seemed perfect. Jessica worked for an IT company, earned her own money, and got along incredibly well with my parents. But there was something I missed. During those fancy parties my parents hosted, I started noticing Jessica spending a lot of time with Bob. At first, I brushed it off. I mean, she was just being friendly, right? They'd talk, laugh a little too much, and there were times when she'd blush after a few glasses of wine. But I was too blind, or maybe too in love, to see the signs. I had no idea that those friendly chats were anything but innocent. Little did I know, Jessica and Bob were having an affair behind my back the entire time. 7 years into our marriage, everything started to unravel. My parents, who had been the backbone of my life, passed away within 6 months of each other. Their deaths hit me hard. It felt like I had lost the only people who truly understood me, and the grief was overwhelming. To cope, I buried myself in work, trying to keep the family business running while dealing with the emotional toll. I figured Jessica, my wife, would be my emotional support, but instead, she grew distant. At first, I chalked it up to her grieving in her own way. Maybe she just needed space to process things. But weeks passed, and she still hadn't said a word to me about my parents or how I was doing. I tried to make excuses for her behavior, blaming myself for not opening up enough, but deep down, I knew something was off. 2 weeks after my parents' funeral, I decided to come home early from work to surprise her. I had bought a bouquet of pink roses, hoping we could finally sit down and talk about everything that had been happening. I thought we could reconnect. When I got home, I opened the door with my key, expecting to find her alone. Instead, I found Bob, yes, the same Bob from the trust fund meetings, standing there with 2 suitcases. I was confused, so I asked him if he was there to talk about some legal issue with the trust. That's when Jessica walked in, carrying her own suitcases. I can't even begin to describe the shock I felt at that moment. Jessica looked me dead in the eyes and said, "Oh, I guess this isn't the way I planned for this to happen. I was going to leave you a note, but now we're doing it face to face. So, yeah, I'm leaving you. I'm moving in with Bob, and we're going on vacation to Italy. Oh, and don't worry, your parents made sure I'm taken care of with their trust fund, so I'll be just fine financially." I stood there, completely speechless. 7 years of marriage, and this was how it ended? With her casually tossing our life aside like it was nothing? She didn't even care that I was standing there, devastated, holding flowers like some fool. She looked at the bouquet, smirked, and said, "Are those for me? Thanks." Then she walked out with Bob before I could even process what had just happened. For the next 2 days, I didn't leave the house. I didn't eat, didn't shower, didn't open the blinds. I just sat there in the dark, trying to wrap my head around what had happened. How could Jessica, the woman I had loved and trusted for years, just walk out like that? And with Bob, of all people. The same guy who managed my family's trust fund. On the 3rd day, the doorbell wouldn't stop ringing. At first, I ignored it, hoping whoever it was would just go away. But they didn't. The ringing turned into banging, and a voice started shouting for me to open up. It was a woman, and for a moment, I thought it might be Jessica coming back to explain herself, but then I realized she was in Italy with Bob. The voice got louder, more impatient, so I finally dragged myself to the door and opened it. Standing there was a red-headed woman in a sharp business suit, and she looked pissed. She barged into my house before I could even say anything and started talking fast. "Your wife ran off with my husband. Sitting here feeling sorry for yourself isn't going to fix anything, so get up, take a shower, and meet me in the living room. We have a lot to talk about." I just stood there, stunned. Who was this woman? And what did she mean, her husband? Then it clicked. This was Sandra, Bob's wife. The pieces started falling into place. Bob and Jessica weren't just running away together. They were blowing up both of our lives in the process. Sandra didn't wait for me to answer. She shot me a glare and said, "And by the way, you stink. Go shower." I found myself nodding like a child being scolded. As I walked to the bathroom, I heard her mutter, "What a mess." For the first time in days, I actually laughed, even if it was just a little. Something about Sandra's no-nonsense attitude snapped me out of my haze. By the time I came back to the living room, Sandra had cleaned up the place like it was her own home. She introduced herself properly, and what she told me next hit me like a ton of bricks. Apparently, she had been digging into Bob's stuff ever since he left, and she had uncovered something huge. Not only had Bob been cheating on her with my wife, but he'd also been siphoning money out of my family's trust fund. And he wasn't doing it alone. Jessica was in on it, helping him pull off the scheme. At first, I didn't want to believe it. Jessica may have left me, but could she really have been part of something so shady? But Sandra wasn't just throwing accusations around. She had proof. She had gone through Bob's emails, his financial records, and found evidence that both he and Jessica had been skimming from the trust for months, maybe even years. As much as I wanted to deny it, the evidence Sandra had was undeniable. Jessica and Bob had been stealing from my family's trust fund for a while, and I'd been completely in the dark. But what could I do? I felt helpless. I didn't know where to start or how to fix any of it. Sandra, though, had a fire in her eyes. She wasn't going to take this lying down. She told me flat out, "I'm going after them. I'm going to make sure Bob pays for every cent he's taken, and I'm going to make sure Jessica doesn't get a dime from you either." Her confidence was contagious, and even though I was still in shock, I found myself nodding. "I'm in," I told her. If we were going to take down Bob and Jessica, I wasn't going to sit on the sidelines. And so, while my ex-wife was sunning herself on a beach in Italy with her affair partner, Sandra and I were planning our revenge. When Jessica and Bob returned from their trip, things moved fast. Sandra had already sent everything to the lawyers. It was only a matter of time before the truth came out. I was at work when I got the first phone call from Jessica. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "What the hell is going on, Eric? Why is Bob telling me we're in trouble? Where's my money?" I could practically hear the panic in her voice, And I won't lie, I felt a sick sense of satisfaction. For so long, I had been the one feeling lost and confused, but now, the tables had turned. "You mean my parents' money?" I asked, my voice calm. "The money that you and Bob were stealing to fund your little vacations? Oh, and by the way, I'm sure you've heard from my lawyer by now." There was silence on the other end, and before she could respond, I hung up. The power shift was intoxicating, but it didn't last long. When I left work that day, Jessica was waiting for me outside. She looked disheveled, like she hadn't slept, her eyes wide with desperation. She ran up to me, blocking my way to the car, her voice frantic. "Eric, please, just explain this to me. Rob said something about trouble, but I don't understand what's happening. I need to hear it from you." She looked at me with those pleading eyes that once made me weak, but I wasn't falling for it this time. I stared at her for a moment before saying, "I'm sure your lawyer explained everything." "You're not getting a cent, Jessica. Not from my parents' trust, not from me. You wanted to live off what they worked for, and now you'll get nothing." The look on her face was priceless. She hadn't anticipated this at all. Jessica had always been so composed, so in control, but now she was falling apart. The panic spread across her face, and for a moment I felt a pang of guilt. I had loved this woman once. Watching her suffer should have felt more satisfying, but instead it was just sad. She had thrown away everything, and for what? A fling with Bob? I don't understand," she stammered. "How could you do this to me? We were supposed to be partners." I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it all. Partners? She had betrayed me in the worst possible way, and now she was trying to make herself the victim. I pushed past her and got into my car. As I drove away, I could see her in the rearview mirror, still standing there, looking lost and defeated. I heard her scream after me, "How could you do this to me?" The irony wasn't lost on me, but I kept driving. Meanwhile, Sandra was working behind the scenes. Rob had been fired from his position at the company that managed my family's trust. His reputation was in ruins, and to top it off, news of his affair with Jessica had leaked, causing a massive scandal that affected his professional life. The company was in damage control mode, firing Rob to protect their name, and several clients had already pulled their contracts. Things were falling apart for him faster than he could keep up. Sandra had managed to get the best lawyer for the case, and she was confident we would win. She had a daughter with Rob and was determined to get full custody, ensuring that he wouldn't have a leg to stand on in court. The updates kept coming in from Sandra, and every new piece of information felt like another step toward justice. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still unresolved inside me. Sure, I was getting my revenge on Jessica and Bob, but it didn't bring me the peace I thought it would. Instead, I felt restless. I needed closure, and I wasn't sure if I was ever going to get it. Later that evening, I sat down and wrote everything out, this whole story, every detail. It felt good to get it out of my system, like a weight had been lifted off my chest. But even as I wrote, I found myself asking, am I going too far with all this? Is this really the best way to handle things? I wanted to be done with Jessica and the betrayal, but part of me was still holding on to the hurt. The next morning, I woke up to another phone call from Jessica. This time, her voice was softer, almost apologetic. "Hey, have you eaten dinner?" she asked, as if everything was normal. When I said no, she followed up with, "Do you want me to come over and cook for you? We can talk." I was floored. After everything that had happened, after she left me for another man, she still thought we could play house? I didn't know whether to be angry or laugh at the sheer absurdity of it. I hesitated, and she must have taken my silence as a yes because she quickly added, "I'll be there in half an hour." That's when I found my voice. "No," I said firmly. "No, you're not coming over here. Are you kidding me? After what you did? You think we can just sit down and talk like nothing happened?" She started to backtrack, saying things like, "I know things have been tough, but we can work through it." That's when I lost it. Tough? You call cheating on me with Bob and stealing from my family tough? You left me for him, and now you want to come over and cook dinner like we're fine? Get the hell out of here. After my outburst, Jessica tried to justify herself, which only made me angrier. "Stop overreacting," she said. I nearly lost it. Overreacting. I had spent days doubting myself, grieving the end of my marriage, wondering if I was being too harsh on her, and now she was acting like none of it was a big deal. That's when everything became clear. Jessica didn't regret a single thing. She wasn't sorry for what she'd done. She would have done it all over again if she had the chance. I hung up on her without saying another word. I couldn't take it anymore. The anger, the confusion, the hurt, it was all too much. But before I could even begin to process what had just happened, I got another call, this time from Sandra. She asked how it went, and when I explained, she quickly came up with a plan. "Call her back," she said. "Tell her to come over. Let's see what she really wants." Sandra was always 2 steps ahead. I hesitated for a moment but realized she was right. We needed to know what Jessica was after now. Was she just trying to manipulate me again? So, I called Jessica back, and as expected, she sounded smug. She assumed I had come to my senses. "I knew you'd call me back. I'll be there in half an hour," she said, confident that she could win me over. About 40 minutes later, Jessica showed up at the house. She had obviously put effort into her appearance, wearing her best outfit and looking like she was ready for a fancy dinner. As soon as she walked in, she kissed me and started heading toward the bedroom. I stopped her and told her to sit down in the dining room instead. "But why, sweetheart?" she pouted. "Don't I have the right to the bedroom anymore? Isn't our love worth fighting for?" Before I could respond, Sandra appeared from the hallway, and Jessica's face drained of color. She stammered, What the hell is she doing here?" Sandra, as calm as ever, smirked. "Oh, hi, Jessica. It's nice to finally meet the woman who stole my husband. And to answer your question, yes, you did lose your right to this bedroom. Just like you lost your right to Eric's money." Jessica looked at me, eyes wide, completely floored by the situation. "You're sleeping with her? You replaced me with Rob's wife? After everything we've been through?" Sandra didn't let her get away with the dramatics. "Oh, don't play the victim. You're the one who's been stealing from Eric, and if that wasn't enough, you threw it all away for my useless husband. Now you want to act like you're owed something? Please." Jessica snapped. "We had debts. Rob and I needed the money, and your husband couldn't have done this on his own. I was the one helping him. Unlike you, Sandra, I stood by him. That's why he chose me." Sandra just smiled, the kind of smile that lets you know she's already won. She turned to me and said, "Well, Eric, I think it's time we sent Jessica home. Our work here is done." I didn't need any further prompting. I opened the door and watched as Jessica stormed out, shouting insults at both of us. It was a chaotic scene, but once the door shut behind her, the house was silent again. I turned to Sandra and asked, "What just happened?" Sandra held up her phone and winked. "We got her, Eric. Everything she just said is on tape. This is more than enough to take them both down." Sandra wasn't just a sharp-tongued woman scorned. She was a mastermind. The next day, she sent the tape of Jessica's confession to her company, along with an explanation of everything that had been going on. She laid it all out, the affair, the theft, the manipulation. She didn't stop there, though. Sandra had connections. She knew one of the business partners at Jessica's firm. That partner suddenly pulled out of a major deal, citing doubts about the integrity of the team, specifically pointing fingers at Jessica. It didn't take long for the news to reach Jessica's boss, and he was livid. The company couldn't afford another scandal, especially not with someone as senior as Jessica. In the end, they fired her to protect their reputation. Just like that, Jessica was out of a job, and so was Rob. Both of them were broke, in debt, and now jobless. Sandra and I stayed in touch throughout the whole process. She was relentless in her pursuit of justice for both of us. Rob tried contacting her multiple times, leaving messages and texts, begging for forgiveness. Sandra didn't bother responding. She blocked his number and moved on. Meanwhile, I was finally starting to feel lighter. I had started therapy, and my therapist helped me process everything that had happened. He said it was normal to feel conflicted, to still care for someone who had hurt me, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the person I loved didn't exist anymore, or maybe she never did. A few days later, Rob's situation got worse. He was arrested after failing to pay some outstanding debts. Apparently, Jessica had to dig into what little savings she had left to bail him out. Karma was hitting them hard, and I couldn't help but feel like it was well-deserved. Then, things took a darker turn. One morning, Sandra called me, furious. Rob had shown up at her house, drunk and belligerent. He rang the doorbell non-stop, shouting insults and demanding to be let in. Sandra threatened to call the police, but Rob didn't back down until she told him she had security cameras recording the entire incident. By the time he left, their young daughter, Emily, was terrified. Sandra asked if I could come over and watch Emily while she went to the police to file a restraining order against Rob. When I got to Sandra's house, it was clear Emily was traumatized. She had locked herself in her room and was too scared to come out. It broke my heart to see such a young child dealing with the aftermath of her father's meltdown. I managed to coax her out with promises of watching her favorite Disney movie. Eventually, she came out, and we spent the afternoon together. Sandra came back from the police station, and for the first time in a long time, the house felt peaceful. As I was about to leave, Emily clung to my leg and wouldn't let go. "Please don't leave," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "What if Daddy comes back?" I promised her I'd stay the night to keep her and her mom safe. That night, as we all slept under the same roof, I realized how much I had changed in such a short time. I was no longer the guy drowning in self-pity, lost and broken by what Jessica had done to me. I was stronger now, and with Sandra's help, I had finally started to reclaim my life. In the end, justice was served. The lawsuit wrapped up in our favor, and both Jessica and Rob were left with nothing. Sandra won full custody of Emily, and Rob was stripped of his rights after his violent outburst. As for Jessica, she disappeared from my life completely. She tried to contact me a few more times, but I ignored every call, every message. I didn't need closure from her anymore. The closure came from knowing that I had stood up for myself and that I had people like Sandra on my side. So, that's my story. I lost my wife, but I gained something far more valuable: my freedom, my dignity, and a new beginning. Thank you for visited my YouTube channel. Your support, likes, and comments truly inspire me to create even more engaging content. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. You're a part of this amazing community, and I'm thrilled to share my stories with you. See you in the next video on YouTube.